Don't trust the police. You're the only one who can save my daughter." The man on the gurney said it with the last clear strength he had, his hand closing around Margaret's wrist hard enough to leave marks she would find the next morning and not understand. His eyes were wide and fixed on her face, as though she were the only solid thing in a world that was sliding away from him. And then he pressed something small and hard into her palm, folded her fingers over it with a desperation that frightened her more than the blood, and said one more word, a name, before the monitors changed their song and the night swallowed him. Margaret Doyle had been a nurse for 19 years. She had held the hands of a great many people as they crossed over. She knew the difference between fear and panic, and she knew the difference between a dying man's confusion and a dying man's certainty. This man had been certain. This is the story of an ordinary woman who was handed a terrible trust by a stranger in his final moment, and of what it cost her to keep it, and of what it would have cost the whole world if she had not. Listen close. The strongest people are almost never the ones the world expects. They are the quiet ones, the tired ones, the ones who show up for the night shift and do their work, and never once imagine that the entire weight of justice could come to rest, one ordinary evening, in their two hands. Margaret Doyle worked the overnight in the emergency department of a hospital on the west side of Chicago, and she had worked it for 11 years, and she had chosen it on purpose. The night shift suited her life. Her daughter, Lily, was 12 years old, and the arrangement they had built together was a careful machine that ran on Margaret being home in the mornings to make breakfast and see her off to school, and being there again in the late afternoon, and slipping out the door after Lily was asleep, leaving her in the care of Mrs. Petrova next door, a wide, kind, watchful Bulgarian widow who treated Lily like the granddaughter the ocean had put too far away to visit. It was a hard life, and Margaret would not have told you it was hard, because she had stopped measuring her life against easier ones a long time ago. Lily's father had left when the girl was 3, left the way some men leave, all at once and then completely, a forwarding address that went stale, and then a silence that became permanent. Margaret had not chased him. She had simply closed that door, quietly, the way you close the door to a room you have decided you will not be heating that winter, and she had turned all of her warmth toward the one person who had stayed. She made breakfast every morning. She checked homework. She knew the names of all of Lily's friends and most of their mothers. She kept a jar on the kitchen counter where loose change went, slowly, toward a trip to the ocean she had been promising Lily for 3 years and had not yet managed to afford, and neither of them mentioned the jar's slowness, because hope is a thing you protect by not looking at it too directly. She was, in every way the world measures these things, an unremarkable woman, a good nurse, a good mother, tired in the way that the good and the responsible are always tired, the kind of person you would pass in a grocery store and never see. That was the woman who was standing at the nurse's station at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in March, when the doors burst open and the paramedics came through fast with a man on a gurney and a great deal of bad news in their faces. He was perhaps 50. Well-dressed, or had been, before the night had done its work on him. He had been found, the paramedics said, in the parking structure of an office building downtown, and the circumstances were the kind that brought a particular tension into the room, the kind of injury that meant questions would be asked later by people with badges. Margaret did not think about any of that in the moment. In the moment there was only the work, the old clean, fierce focus of it, the team moving around the man like the parts of a single machine built to push back against death. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She did her part without thinking, her hands knowing the work the way a musician's hands know a song. But he was too far gone. She saw it before the doctor said it. She had seen it too many times not to know the look of a person whose business with this world was very nearly finished. And in the last moments, in the strange, clear window that the dying are sometimes given, when the panic falls away and something steady comes up from underneath, the man turned his head and looked at her. Not at the doctor, not at the equipment, at her, as though, of all the people in that bright, loud room, he had chosen her. "You," he said. His voice was barely there, but his eyes were not. "You're a mother." It was not a question, and Margaret did not know how he knew it, and she would wonder about that for the rest of her life. Perhaps it was something in her face. Perhaps the dying see more clearly than the living. She only nodded, leaning close because his voice was failing. And that was when his hand came up and closed around her wrist with that terrible strength. "Don't trust the police," he said. "You're the only one who can save my daughter. Sir, you need to listen." The hand tightened. His eyes burned into her. "There's no time, and I can't trust anyone else. And I'm choosing you because you're a stranger, and because you're a mother, and because there's no one left I can trust." Each word cost him something she could see him paying. "They'll come looking for what I have. They have people everywhere. Everywhere. The ones who are supposed to help. Some of them are theirs. You can't know which, so you trust no one with a badge. Do you understand me?" And then he pressed the small hard thing into her palm and folded her fingers over it, and his last clear word was a name. "Sarah," he said. "Find Sarah." The monitors changed their song. The team moved. Margaret stepped back to let them work. Her fist closed around the thing he had given her, and she watched them try, and she watched them fail, and she watched a doctor she respected look at the clock and say a time out loud, and she stood at the edge of all of it with a stranger's last words burning in her ears, and a stranger's last secret hidden in her hand. And she did the one thing her 19 years of training had taught her to do in the presence of death. She kept her composure. She kept her hands steady, and she did not, by so much as a flicker of her face, let anyone in that room see that anything had passed between her and the man who had just died. She did not know, yet, why she hid it. Only that he had told her to trust no one, and that he had been certain, and that some instinct older than her training told her to believe him. Later, in the supply closet, alone, she opened her hand. It was a small memory card, the kind that goes into a camera, black, ordinary, scratched, the kind of thing you could lose in the bottom of a bag and never find again. She closed her hand around it and stood for a long time in the dark among the boxes of gloves and gauze, her heart going hard, and she thought about her daughter asleep in a small apartment with a kind old woman 2 doors down, and she thought about a man who had looked at her and known she was a mother, and she understood, without yet knowing a single fact about what she was holding, that her quiet, careful life had just changed, and that there would be no changing it back. She finished her shift. That was the strange thing she would remember later, that she finished her shift, charted her patients, gave her hand off to the day nurse, did all of it with her ordinary competent calm, while the memory card sat in the inner pocket of her bag like a live coal. She had decided nothing yet, she told herself, driving home through the gray dawn, that she would think about it, that there was no rush, that perhaps the right thing was simply to bring it to the proper authorities after all, and let the dying man's fear be only the fear of a dying man. That comfortable possibility lasted until 11 o'clock that morning, when 2 men in good suits came to the hospital asking about the patient who had died overnight. Margaret was already home by then, asleep, but the day charge nurse, a friend, a woman named Dana who had worked beside Margaret for years, called her that afternoon, and there was an odd note in Dana's voice. 2 men came by, Dana said, about the man who passed last night, the one from the parking garage. Police? That's the thing. A pause. They said they were. They had the look, but they were asking strange questions, Margaret, not the usual ones. They wanted to know if he'd said anything before he died, if he'd given anyone anything. They kept asking that, in different ways, whether he'd handed anybody anything. Another pause, and they wanted to know which nurses had been on him, by name. Margaret stood in her kitchen, the phone against her ear, looking at the jar of change on the counter, and felt the floor tilt under her. "What did you tell them?" she asked, and was proud of how level her voice came out. "I told them I'd have to check the records, and then I got busy, and they got tired of waiting, and they left." Dana's voice dropped. "Margaret, I've talked to a lot of real detectives over the years. These 2, I don't know, something about them sat wrong. The way they looked at the room when they thought nobody was watching, like they were casing it." She let out a breath. "Probably nothing. Probably I'm tired and reading too much into it. But I figured you'd want to know, since you were the one with him at the end. The ones who are supposed to help. Some of them are theirs. You can't know which." "Thank you, Dana," Margaret said softly. "You did right to call me. And, do me a favor. Don't give anybody my name. Not yet. Not until I understand what this is." There was a silence on the line. "You know something," Dana said. It was not an accusation. It was the voice of a friend who had just understood that her friend was standing on the edge of something. "I think I might," Margaret said. "And the less you know, the safer you are. So please, trust me on this one, and forget we talked." She hung up. She stood in her kitchen for a long time, and then she did the thing that the dying man's certainty had been quietly demanding of her since 2 o'clock that morning. She went and found her old laptop, the slow one, the one that had no connection to anything, and she pushed the memory card into it, and she opened what was inside. She was not a person who understood the world the man had lived in. She wants that understood, all these years later. She was a nurse, not a detective, and what she found on that card she understood only slowly, and only because the man had been careful enough to leave it in a form a frightened ordinary person could follow. There were documents. There were recordings. A man's voice. The same voice that had whispered to her as he died, calm and methodical, narrating dates and names and meetings. There were photographs of papers, of ledgers, of transfers, and there was, at the very top, a single video file, and when Margaret opened it, the dead man looked out at her from the screen, alive and well, and sitting at a desk, speaking directly into the camera, as though he had known, even then, that someday a stranger would be watching. "My name is David Mercer," he said. "If you are watching this, then I am very likely dead, and you have found what I spent the last year of my life building, and I am sorry, I am truly sorry, for the danger it has now placed you in." Margaret sat very still. David Mercer, the dead man explained, had been an accountant. Not a criminal. That was the thing he wanted whoever found this to understand first, and he said it plainly. He had been an ordinary accountant who, years ago, had taken on a client who paid very well and asked very few questions, and by the time David Mercer understood what that client truly was, he was already too deep inside it to simply walk away. He had spent years moving money he should not have moved, telling himself the lie that men in his position tell themselves, that he was only doing the numbers, that the numbers were not the crime, that the crime belonged to other people. And then his wife had died, quietly, of an illness, nothing to do with any of it, and David Mercer had been left alone with a young daughter and a conscience he could no longer drown out with the comfortable lie. "I decided," he said into the camera, "that I would not let my daughter grow up the daughter of a man who helped them. I decided I would gather everything, every name, every account, every crime I had a record of, and I would bring it all down. I knew what it would cost me. I have made my peace with what it will cost me." His voice did not waver. Margaret, watching, understood that she was looking at a man who had decided to die well in payment for having lived badly, and there was something in it that moved her more than she could have explained. "But I cannot make peace with what it will cost her," David Mercer said. "My daughter, Sarah, she is 8 years old, and if they learn what I have done, and they will learn it, they learn everything, they will use her against me, or worse. So I have hidden her. I have placed her somewhere safe, with people I trust, under a name that is not her own, and I have told no one where, not the police, not anyone, because they have people in the police. I have seen the proof of it with my own eyes, and that proof is on this card, and it is the reason I cannot simply walk into a station and hand this over. The moment I do, the wrong person sees it, and Sarah is gone, and everything I have done is for nothing." He leaned closer to the camera. "So whoever you are," he said, "I am asking you to do 2 things. The first is to find a way to get what is on this card to someone honest, someone outside the reach of the people I am exposing, someone who cannot be bought or threatened, because they exist. I promise you they exist. You only have to be careful and patient enough to find them. And the second thing, the harder thing, the thing I have no right to ask of a stranger, and am asking anyway because there is no one else left, is to find my daughter. The instructions are on this card. Find Sarah. Make sure she is safe. Make sure she is loved. Make sure she grows up knowing that her father, whatever else he was, did one true thing at the end." The video ended. Margaret Doyle sat alone in her small apartment in the fading afternoon light, with the dead man's face frozen on the screen and the dead man's voice still in her ears, and she understood, completely now, the shape of the thing that had been placed in her hands. She was holding the only copy of evidence that could destroy a powerful and dangerous organization. They knew it existed. They were already looking for it, and for whoever had it. And somewhere in the city, there was a frightened 8-year-old girl, hidden under a false name, whose father had just died, who did not yet know she was now alone in the world, except for a tired night shift nurse she had never met, who had been chosen by a dying stranger, for no better reason than that she was a mother, and that she was the last person he saw. A different woman might have run. A different woman might have wiped the card, dropped it down a storm drain, and gone back to her quiet life and her change jar, and her promise of the ocean, and told herself it was the sensible thing, the safe thing, the thing any reasonable person would do. Margaret thought about it. Let it be remembered that she thought about it, seriously, like a responsible person weighing the safety of her own child against the cry of a stranger's. And then she thought about Lily. She thought about what it would mean to be the kind of mother who could hear what David Mercer had asked and turn away from it. She thought about the woman she had spent 12 years trying to be in front of her own daughter, and she understood that she could not save Lily from the world by becoming, in secret, a person Lily would be ashamed of. You cannot teach a child courage by practicing cowardice where she cannot see. Margaret took the memory card out of the laptop. She held it in her hand for a moment, and then she began, carefully, to think. She was not a brave fool, and that is important to understand, because the world is full of stories about brave fools, and this is not one of them. Margaret Doyle was a careful woman, and she approached the most dangerous problem of her life, the way she approached a difficult patient, methodically, without panic, doing the next right thing and then the next. She made rules for herself. The first rule was that Lily would know nothing. Whatever happened, her daughter would be kept entirely outside it, ignorant, and therefore innocent, and therefore, Margaret hoped, safe. She would carry this alone. The second rule was that she would trust no one with a badge until she was certain of them. David Mercer had been clear, and Dana's strange visitors had confirmed it, and Margaret was not going to gamble a child's life on the hope that the first official she found was an honest one. The third rule was that she needed to make copies. This terrified her. It felt like multiplying the danger, but she understood the logic of it. As long as there was only one copy of the card was the prize, and she was the only obstacle between the prize and the people who wanted it. The moment copies existed, safely hidden, the card lost its power as a single point of failure. So she made copies, 3 of them, slowly and carefully on her old disconnected laptop, and she hid them in 3 separate places that had nothing to do with each other and nothing obvious to do with her, a thing she will not describe here, because the methods of careful people should not be made into lessons for the careless. The fourth rule was the hardest, and it was about Sarah. The instructions on the card led, through a series of careful steps David Mercer had laid out, to a small town 2 hours north, and to a retired couple, friends of his late wife, people with no visible connection to him, people he had chosen precisely because no one would ever think to look at them. The little girl was with them, living under the name of a granddaughter who was visiting for a long while. She was safe, for now, exactly as her father had promised. But for now is the most fragile phrase in any language, and Margaret knew that the moment the organization understood that Sarah existed and mattered, that small, safe town would stop being safe. So Margaret did not go to her, not yet. Going to her would have meant possibly leading them straight to her. Instead, Margaret did something stranger and harder. She watched, from a distance, and she waited, and she carried the knowledge of where that child was like a stone in her chest, and she made absolutely certain that nothing she did would draw a single eye toward that quiet town. For 2 weeks, she lived 2 lives. By day and in the evening, she was Margaret Doyle, the nurse, the mother, making breakfast, checking homework, dropping coins in the change jar, kissing Lily's forehead. And underneath, in the spaces between, she was something else, a careful, frightened, determined woman, trying to solve an impossible problem without anyone she loved ever knowing she was solving it. The men came back to the hospital twice more. Dana, true to her word, gave them nothing, and warned Margaret each time, and Margaret began to vary her routine, to take different routes, to notice the cars on her street the way she had never noticed cars before. She did not tell Lily why she suddenly wanted to know exactly where her daughter was, every minute of every day. She simply tightened the careful machine of their life, quietly. And Lily, being 12 and self-absorbed in the blessed way of the safe, never noticed a thing. And then, on the 14th night, the circle closed enough to touch her. She came home from her shift in the gray dawn, and there was a car on her street that did not belong there. She noticed it the way she now noticed everything. A dark sedan, parked across from her building, 2 shapes inside it, the engine off and the windows just slightly fogged in a way that told her the men inside had been sitting there a long time. Margaret did not slow down. She did not look twice. She drove past her own building as though it were not hers, around the block, and parked 2 streets over, and sat in her car with her hands very steady on the wheel, and her heart going like a fist on a door. They were watching her building. Whether they knew, yet, that she was the one, or whether they were simply working their way down a list of everyone who had been in that emergency room that night, she could not tell. But it did not matter. They were close. The thing she had told herself she had time for had just announced that her time was nearly gone. Her first thought was not for herself. Her first thought, complete and overwhelming, was Lily. Her daughter was asleep in that building, 2 doors down from Mrs. Petrova, in the small, safe apartment that was no longer safe. And Margaret understood in that cold dawn that every careful thing she had done, the copies, the routes, the silence, had been the patient work of someone who believed she had weeks. She did not have weeks. She did the calm thing. She always did the calm thing. It was the deepest part of her, deeper than fear. She took out her phone, and she called Mrs. Petrova, and she said, in a light, ordinary voice in case anyone was ever listening, that she'd been called in to cover a double, and wondered if Lily could come stay at her place for a day or 2, the way they'd arranged before. And Mrs. Petrova, who heard everything in the things Margaret did not say, answered just as lightly that of course she could. The child was no trouble at all. She'd make her breakfast right now. And then Margaret sat in her car 2 streets from her own home, watching the dawn come up over a city that had turned dangerous, and understood that her cleverness had run out, and that her caution had bought her exactly the time it had bought her, and not 1 hour more. She could feel that her cleverness was buying time, and only time, and that time was running out, and that she could not solve this alone. She needed the one thing David Mercer had told her existed, and had not been able to find before he died. An honest authority, outside the reach of the people in the card. Someone who could not be bought or threatened. The trouble was that finding such a person meant taking a risk. It meant trusting someone, and every instinct the dying man had planted in her screamed against it. In the end, it was Mrs. Petrova who showed her the way, without ever knowing it. The old woman next door, who watched Lily on the night shifts, had a nephew. She mentioned him the way the old mentioned their family, with pride and at length and without being asked. Her sister's boy, come up the hard way, a serious young man, a federal man, she said, with the particular reverence some immigrants keep for the institutions of the country that took them in. He worked for the government, in the part that chases the big criminals, the ones the local police cannot or will not touch. He had come to dinner last month and brought flowers and listened to her stories, and did not look at his phone once, which in Mrs. Petrova's estimation made him very nearly a saint. Margaret had heard the story 6 times and never listened. Now, suddenly, she listened. A federal man, not local police, which was exactly the category David Mercer had warned her away from. Federal. The part of the law that exists, in some measure, precisely to deal with corruption in the smaller parts. Someone who might be outside the circle. Someone whose own family she happened to know, and trust, and have a way to reach that, left no record, and raised no flag. It was not certainty. There was no certainty to be had, but it was the first path Margaret had found that did not require her to walk blindly up to a stranger with a badge and hope. It was a thread connected to a person she actually trusted. And trust, real trust, the kind built over years of a kind old woman watching your child while you worked, was the one currency the organization could not counterfeit. She thought about it for 3 days. 3 days, while the men circled and the stones sat in her chest, and the little girl 2 hours north went on living under a borrowed name, not knowing. And then she went to Mrs. Petrova's apartment, and she sat at the old woman's kitchen table over tea, and she said, carefully, that she had a delicate matter, a thing she could not fully explain, and that she wondered whether the old woman's nephew, the serious one, the federal man, might be willing to meet with her, quietly, off the record, on the strength of his aunt's word that Margaret was a good woman, who would not waste his time. Mrs. Petrova looked at her for a long moment with her wise old eyes that had seen a great deal of the world's trouble in a country far away before she ever came here. "You are in something," the old woman said. It was not a question. "Yes," Margaret said. "Something dangerous." "Yes. And you cannot tell me what." "For your sake," Margaret said, "and for Lily's. The less you know, the safer you both are. I would never bring this near her. You have to believe that. I am trying to keep it as far from her as I can, while still doing a thing I cannot, in good conscience, walk away from." Mrs. Petrova was quiet. Then she reached across the table and put her old hand over Margaret's, the same hand that had braided Lily's hair 100 times. "My nephew is a good boy," she said. "An honest boy. In the old country, my husband was a man who would not look away from wrong things, and it cost us everything, and it is why we are here. I know that look. You have it now." She patted Margaret's hand. "I will call him tonight. And Margaret, whatever it is, you are not as alone as you feel. Remember this." The nephew's name was Daniel Petrov, and he was perhaps 35, and when Margaret met him in a back booth of an all-night diner on the far side of the city, a place she chose, at an hour she chose, after a route that doubled back on itself twice, she understood within 5 minutes why his aunt was so proud of him. He was serious, as advertised. He listened more than he spoke. He did not laugh at her, and he did not rush her. And when she laid out, carefully and in order, the thing that had happened in her emergency department, and the thing she had found on the card, and the warning the dying man had given her about the police, he did not dismiss the warning. That, more than anything, was what made her trust him. A dishonest man, or a foolish one, would have brushed past David Mercer's fear. Daniel Petrov took it seriously. "He was right to be careful," Daniel said quietly, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I'm not going to insult you or him by pretending otherwise. These organizations, the serious ones, they don't survive by being stupid. They buy what they can buy and they frighten what they can't. Local departments, certain offices, yes, it happens." He was right, that handing this to the wrong person would have gotten that little girl killed and accomplished nothing. He looked up at her. But he was also right that honest people exist. I'd like to think I'm one of them. I can't prove it to you. I can only tell you that my agency, the part of it I work in, exists specifically to be outside the reach of the kind of local corruption he was afraid of, and that I have spent 10 years putting away exactly the kind of people who are on that card. A pause. And that I would no more let a child come to harm, to win a case, than I'd let it happen to my own. "How do I know that's true?" Margaret asked. It was not hostile. It was the honest question of a woman, with a child's life in the balance. "You don't," Daniel said simply. "Not for certain. There's no certainty here. There's only my word and my aunt's word about me, and your own read on a person, which, forgive me, I'd guess is pretty good given your line of work. Nurses learn to read people fast." He met her eyes. "So here's what I'll do. I'll tell you exactly what happens next. Every step, in advance, and if at any point I do something I didn't tell you I'd do, you'll know I lied, and you can walk away and burn the whole thing down before I get anywhere near that girl. I'll earn your trust one promise at a time, and I'll keep every one. That's the most any honest person can offer. The rest is up to you." It was, Margaret thought, almost exactly the way Detective Cole, though she had never heard that name and never would, was, in another part of the city in another story, offering the same hard, honest bargain to another frightened woman. The world has more than one honest person in it. They are simply harder to find than the other kind, and they make worse promises, smaller, slower, truer promises, because they will not lie to make you feel safe. Margaret took the bargain. What followed was patient and careful and took the better part of a month, And it was, Margaret would say later, the most frightened she had ever been for that long without ever once being able to show it. Daniel Petrov was as good as his word. He told her each step before he took it. He brought in only people he had personally trusted for years, a small tight circle, kept deliberately small because David Mercer had taught all of them, from beyond the grave, exactly how a large circle leaks. The evidence on the card was authenticated, cross-checked against years of the agency's own painstaking and frustrated work. For it turned out, as it so often does, that honest investigators had been circling this same organization for a long time and had simply never been able to get inside it. David Mercer's card was the inside. It was the thing they had needed and never had, a complete, documented account from a man who had sat in the very center of the machine and written down everything. "Do you understand what this is?" Daniel asked her once, late, his voice hushed with something close to awe, after a long night of going through it. "People spend whole careers and never get a tenth of this. He didn't just give us names, he gave us the architecture, the whole thing, how the money moves, who it moves to, which officials look away and what they were paid to look away." He shook his head slowly. He must have known, at the end, that he was holding the most dangerous thing in the city, and he handed it to a stranger in an emergency room because he'd run out of every other kind of person he could trust. Daniel looked at her with a respect she would carry for the rest of her life, and he chose right. You know that? Out of everyone in that room, in that whole city, he chose exactly right. But the evidence was only half of it. The other half, the half that mattered more to Margaret than any case, the half she had been carrying like a stone since the first night, was Sarah. And here Daniel did the thing that finally and completely won Margaret's trust. Before they moved on the organization at all, before a single arrest, before anything that might cause the machine to thrash and lash out, he made absolutely certain that the little girl 2 hours north was safe. He arranged it quietly, with people he trusted, in a way that drew no attention and changed nothing visible in that small town, so that when the reckoning came, it would find Sarah already beyond the reach of anyone who might think to use her. He put the child first. He put the child before the case. And in doing so, he proved, more than any words could have, that David Mercer's terrible trust had finally landed, after passing through the hands of a stranger, exactly where it needed to land. When everything was ready, when the evidence was airtight and the child was safe and the small, honest circle was in position, they moved all at once. This story will not dwell on the details of that reckoning, because this is not a story about that kind of thing, and because the truest part of it was never the danger anyway. Let it be enough to say that it came down on the organization the way a long-delayed verdict comes down, all at once, complete, leaving no time to run and no leverage to bargain. The names David Mercer had written down were, one after another, called to account. The officials who had looked away were looked at last, by people they could not pay. The machine that had frightened a dying accountant into hiding his own daughter was, in the space of a single coordinated day, simply ended. And the 2 men who had come to the hospital, the ones with the wrong look in their eyes, they were among the names. They never did find what they were looking for. They never did learn that the tired night shift nurse they had passed over as unimportant had been carrying it the whole time and had quietly handed it to the one kind of person they could not reach. There remained the promise, the harder promise, the one a dying man had no right to ask of a stranger and had asked anyway, because there was no one else. Find Sarah. Make sure she is safe. Make sure she is loved. The retired couple 2 hours north had done well by the little girl, had loved her, in the careful way of people keeping a frightening secret, had kept her fed and warm, and as untroubled as a child can be who has lost her mother, and then, though she did not fully understand it yet, her father too. But they were old, and they had taken her as an emergency, a thing held in trust until someone came, and they could not be her family forever. When it was finally safe, when the reckoning was complete and the danger truly past, Margaret drove north, with Daniel's blessing and Daniel's quiet protection somewhere in the background, to meet the child she had been carrying in her heart for 2 months, without ever having seen her face. Sarah Mercer was 8 years old. She was small for her age, and grave in the way of children who have had to be braver than children should have to be. And she had her father's eyes, Margaret saw it the instant she walked into the room. The same steady, searching look that David Mercer had turned on her from the gurney, as though weighing whether the world could be trusted. Margaret knelt down to the little girl's level. She did not rush. She had 19 years of experience meeting frightened people at the worst moments of their lives, and she knew that you do not heal anything by hurrying it. "Hello, Sarah," she said gently. "My name is Margaret. I knew your dad." The little girl studied her with those grave, searching eyes. "He's not coming back," Sarah said. It was not a question. Children know. They always know, even when the adults around them are still pretending. "No, sweetheart," Margaret said softly. "He's not, and I am so sorry." The little girl's chin trembled, but she did not cry, not yet. She held it. The way her father had held his fear in the parking garage, the way the brave hold things they are not yet ready to let go of. "But I want to tell you something about your dad," Margaret went on, "and I need you to listen, because it's the most important thing anyone will ever tell you about him." She took the small grave girl's hands in her own. "Your father loved you more than anything in the whole world, so much that at the very end, when he was the most frightened he had ever been, the only thing he thought about, the only thing, was making sure you were safe. He used the very last of his strength to protect you. And he made me promise. He made a complete stranger promise. That I would find you, and make sure you were safe, and make sure you were loved, and make sure you grew up knowing that your father, at the end, did a brave and a good and a true thing." Margaret's own voice caught now, just slightly. "He kept his promise to you, Sarah. With his whole life he kept it. And now I'm going to keep mine to him. I'm not going to leave you alone, not ever. Do you understand?" And the little girl, who had been so brave for so long, who had held everything in those small, steady hands for longer than any 8-year-old should ever have to, the little girl finally let go and wept and let herself be held by a stranger who had become, in the strange arithmetic of love and courage, something no stranger had any right to be. There is a coda, and it is the part that matters most. Margaret Doyle did not become anyone's idea of a hero. There were no headlines with her name in them. The records were sealed, the source protected, the case credited, as such cases are, to the patient, honest work of an agency that accepted the praise with straight faces and never once corrected anyone, which was exactly as Margaret wanted it. She had a daughter to protect, and protection lives in being forgotten. But there were 2 girls in her apartment now, where there had been one. It was not simple. These things never are. There were lawyers, and there were quiet, careful arrangements that Daniel Petrov shepherded through with the same patient honesty he had shown from the first night in the diner. And there was a long, slow road to making Sarah legally and permanently, and truly, part of the small, fierce family that Margaret had spent 12 years building for one, and now rebuilt, without hesitation, for 2. There was the matter of telling Lily. Margaret had kept her own daughter entirely outside the danger, as she had sworn to, and only when it was all safely over did she sit Lily down and tell her the truth. Not all of it, not the parts that would frighten a 12-year-old, but the true heart of it, that a man had died, and had asked Margaret to take care of his little girl, and that Margaret had said yes, and that their family was about to grow. Margaret had braced herself for jealousy, for resentment, for all the ordinary difficulties of asking a child to share a mother she had never had to share. What she got instead, after the first wide-eyed silence, was her own daughter looking at her with something Margaret had not expected and would never forget. "You did that?" Lily said. "You took care of somebody's kid when you didn't even know them? Because a stranger asked you to." "I did," Margaret said carefully. "Are you upset?" And Lily, 12 years old and suddenly a little older than 12, thought about it and then shook her head slowly. "No," she said. That's the most you thing I've ever heard." And then, after a pause, with the fierce loyalty of a child who has decided something, "She can have the top bunk. The new kid always gets scared at night. I'll take the bottom so I'm closer to the door." That was how Sarah Mercer came to have a sister. The change jar on the kitchen counter filled up faster than it ever had, because there were 2 girls dropping coins in it now, and because Daniel Petrov, who came to Sunday dinners and brought flowers for his aunt, and never once looked at his phone, had a way of leaving folded bills in the jar when he thought no one was watching, which everyone always was. And one summer, the summer after the worst spring of Margaret Doyle's life, the jar was finally, at last, full enough. They drove east, the three of them, Margaret and Lily and Sarah, until the land ran out and the water began, and they stood at the edge of the continent in the early morning, with their shoes in their hands, and the two girls ran shrieking into the cold gray Atlantic while their mother, for that is what Margaret was now, twice over, by blood and by promise, stood on the wet sand and watched them, and felt the salt wind on her face, and thought about a man named David Mercer who had looked at her across a bright, loud room on the worst night of his life, and somehow known that she was a mother, and somehow known that it would be enough. "You're the only one who can save my daughter," he had said. He had been right, but not in the way he meant. He had thought he was asking a stranger to do a single desperate thing. What he had actually done, though he died before he could ever know it, was reach across the very edge of his own life to place his child into the hands of a family that would love her, and a sister who would give her the top bunk, and a mother who kept her promises, and an ocean that two little girls would one day run into together, shrieking, alive, free. So, the world is full of stories about powerful people, and the terrible things they do, and the terror they spread. This was almost one of those stories. It had all the makings of one: a dangerous organization, a frightened man, a deadly secret, a circle closing in. And it turned instead into a different kind of story entirely, because of one ordinary woman who showed up for the night shift. Not a powerful woman, not a brave fool, not a hero in any way the world keeps track of. Only a tired, careful, loving nurse who was handed an impossible trust by a dying stranger, and who did not run, and did not look away, and did the next right thing, and then the next, until the whole vast, frightening weight of it had been carried all the way through to the other side, and set down, at last, safe. The strongest people are almost never the ones the world expects. They are the quiet ones, the tired ones, the ones who keep their promises when no one is watching, and ask for nothing in return, and would tell you, if you called them brave, that they only did what anyone would do. They are wrong about that last part. Not anyone would. She did. And two little girls ran into the ocean because of it.